Susan Bernofsky is an American translator of German language, literature, and author. She is best known for bringing the Swiss writer Robert Wassler to the attention of the English-speaking world, translating many of his books and writing his biography. She has also translated several books by Jenny Eppenberg and Yoko Tawada. In 2017, she won the Warwick Prize for Women in Translation for her translation of Memoirs of a Polar Bear by Yoko Tawada. In this episode, she spoke about her views on translations, the author Yoko Tawada, and her translation of Tawada's novel Spontaneous Acts, released in July 2024. Spontaneous Acts, written by Tawada in Berlin during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, pays homage to Paul Celan, a long-standing influence on her work. Arguably, the most important German language poet of the post-World War II era, Celan is known for the diamond-hard density of his lyrical lines, estranging words from their inherited meanings, and thereby opening up new avenues of association and interpretation. You can read Yoko Tawada's article on Paul Celan's poems written in 2013 via the link in the show notes. To buy the book Spontaneous Acts, a link is provided in the show notes. Please follow and review the Harshaneeyam Podcast on Spotify and Apple apps.
So, what's your earliest memory of encountering German language?
My father had studied German. He was a scientist, and he was born in 1933, and in his generation, the American scientists had to learn German as the language of science. So he was attached to the idea that I would learn German, and he tried to start that along when I was quite young by bringing sort of these bilingual fairy tales into the house for me to look at, like children's books with fairy tales and the German writing, and then a transliteration to show how it would be pronounced, and then an English translation. I remember reading these, and I even brought one of them to school to, I don't know, did I do a little presentation at school? I don't know. But later, I realized that one of these that I remember was called the Three Bears. And the Three Bears is at Goldilocks, and the Three Bears is actually a British fairy tale. And so it was sort of a misunderstanding that was included in the series, because it wasn't a German fairy tale to start with. But, so I started being exposed to German very early on, but it certainly wasn't spoken in the household or anything.
You edited a series of essays and published a book called In Translation, Translators on Their Work.
Yes.
In that, you wrote an essay called Translation and the Art of Revision.
I teach literary translation. That's what I do as an academic. And if you teach classes in which there are certain topics that appear over and over, it gets really boring to say the same thing over and over again. And so instead of talking about what I think revision is in the case of literary translation, I just sat down and put everything that I knew and believed at the time about it into an essay. And that essay is Translation and the Art of Revision. So I talked about how I myself go about revising translations, gave some examples, talked about how that came to be. Of course, at the time that I wrote that essay, I had not yet started doing the thing I'm doing now, which is doing a new translation of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, which is 1,100 pages long in the German. It'll be shorter in English because there's always some compression between German and English. But all the things that I said about revision in my essay, I can't really follow because this book is too long. And the way that I used to revise translations just involved doing really multiple drafts, a large number of drafts. And I talked in the essay about what kind of work I do in each draft. And this was true for years. I translated everything this way, but I'd never translated something longer than, 350, 380 pages. And so now with this huge book, there's no way you can do 4 drafts of a book that's 1,100 pages long. It's just, it would take more lifetimes than I have. So new method, Will I revise the essay? I don't know.
Okay. This is my favorite topic all the time. So, on many forums, you talked about the translator being a writer.
Mm-hmm. It's my favorite topic.
In fact, we had a long chat with Damien Cyrils on our podcast about it.
Mm-hmm.
Translators being a writer. So, can you please elaborate on that?
Sure. I mean, a lot of people who've never tried translation or haven't thought about it that much just think that what you do when you translate is just take a book and then look up each word in the dictionary and replace it with what the dictionary tells you is the translation of that word, and you put it all together, and then you have a translation of the book. Whereas anyone who's ever tried it knows that that's the most absurd nonsense, and that really to translate a book is to be able to abstract from the words of the original what it is that the essence of that book is, what is creating the voice and the style. And these are things that really are not only semantic. And so it requires a certain skill in just putting things into words, describing things. And when you translate, you're very often confronted with things that are perhaps very natural to say in one language, but maybe not so much in the language you're translating into. And so you have to be resourceful and figure out ways to say something that you wouldn't ordinarily be saying in your language. And so all of these require writerly skills. And a lot of translators, come to translation through creative writing. I mean, I think Damien's such a person. I too did an MFA, Master of Fine Arts in Fiction Writing, back when I was planning to be a novelist when I grew up. And I started translating also around the same time. And I was writing and translating one and then the other in between and doing them both. And I feel like I grew up as a translator at the same time as I was growing up as a writer. And translation turns out to be the area in which I do most of my work now. But all of these skills are extremely, extremely intermeshed, intertangled. Yeah, and I'm very happy where I'm teaching now because I teach in a creative writing program where all the students who are studying translation with me are writing their own work in English. And there are a lot of students who are first language speakers of languages other than English, but English is the language in which they're studying writing, and then studying translation into English is just another layer of their studies, and it makes you think about language much more consciously. You're for a moment, you stop thinking about what it is you're trying to say and have to focus very intensely on how this thing will get said, how it was said in another language, and what possibilities there are for getting it said in the second language.
You wrote a biography too, that is Robert Walser's biography, Clairvoyant of the Small. So, how was the experience as compared to your translations?
It was completely different. It was also very humbling because, Robert Walser was somebody who I started translating more than 30 years ago. He was somebody that I translated very young and worked on and off and continuously for decades. I think I translated 8 books of his. So I felt like I knew him very well, and this was not true. I knew his writing very well. And then when I sat down to write the biography, all of a sudden, all these things that I felt that I knew about him were really coming out of his work. But he's somebody who really loved to put on masks in his work and pretend to be other people and play just play with identity and who was he to begin with. And, all of a sudden I was like, okay, so all these things that I believe I know about him, how many of these can I actually produce evidence for? And that was a much smaller number. And then, I learned new things about him by looking at the actual facts of his life as opposed to the things he told about himself.
No, now that I asked you, in fact, if I see your books titles that you have translated, three names prominently figure. One is, of course, Robert Wasler, and the other one is Jenny Erpenbeck. In fact, we spoke to a Romanian translator, Marina Sofia. She had very nice things to say about your, Erpenbeck's translations.
Oh, that's kind. A lot of the translators will look at each other's work. Of course, I can't look at the Romanian translation because my language skills are.
Yeah, she knows German too. That's the advantage.
Well, of course. No, of course. But to be able to triangulate between another language, it's useful, especially if you're doing something very difficult.
Other name, of course, is Robert Wasler. What is so attractive about his writing to you?
Oh, he's so much fun. He's so much fun. He's extremely playful. I mean, all writers, who's a writer who isn't playful, but his writing is really funny, and he writes these incredibly long sentences, but the length of them is like a joke. And he's making fun of bureaucratic language. And there's his story and what he writes about, the things are very dark, but he writes about them with a very sort of open-hearted, gentle love of the world. And I'm just very moved by him and the way he plays with language. I mean, I've been reading him for years, and he still just delights me. I'll read something I haven't read before, haven't read for a long time, and just keep laughing with pleasure because he has so many surprising ideas for how to put sentences together. And, he also, he was a modernist, early 20th century writer, and he was a quite early adopter of the modernist idea that when you're telling a story, you're not just giving a simple account of something that's happened, a transparent account. The modernist writers like Walser are very rare that storytelling changes the story. That storytelling, is the story in a sense. And that there's something very artificial about the way we tell stories as if we were doing it realistically. And rather than try and hide that level, like, a lot of 19th century novelists who are working the realist mode might try to just make it seem like it's transparent, like you're just sitting down and reading the newspaper and getting the story. But in fact, there's so much artistry and art in what they're doing. And the modernists like Walser are like, nope, look, there's writing. And then in the middle of the story, he'll talk about writing the story that he's telling and talk about needing a cigarette break, or, he's always breaking the illusion.
Now we will come to the current topic, Yoko Tawada. This is the first novel I read of Yoko Tawada in your translation. That is the Spontaneous Acts. The title, I think, in US edition and UK edition, they are different.
The title of the American edition, Paul Celan and the Trans-Tibetan Angel, is based on the original German title, although it's not identical with the title that the book was published under in German, because the German publisher also changed the title slightly, and we decided to revert to what had been Yoko Tawada's original title, Paul Celan and the Trans-Tibetan Angel, which is a fierce title. The title in German would translate literally to Paul Celan and the Chinese Angel. That one had been changed because I think the German publisher thought it was strange and complicated, that it was trans-Tibetan business. And so Yoko Tawada compromised with her publisher, and it was called Paul Celan and the Chinese Angel. And when the American publisher asked, why Chinese Angel? Because there's no Chinese character in the book. There's a character who is referred to the whole time as the Trans-Tibetan man. And he's called Trans-Tibetan because he has a grandfather who was Chinese, who came from China to Paris to practice acupuncture, Chinese medicine. Chinese in the sense of Chinese medicine, but the character himself was never described that way. On the other hand, it's very fierce of Yoko Tawada to use the word Trans-Tibetan to refer to, in fact, China. China is the country that is on the other side of Tibet, which China wishes not to recognize. Yoko Tawada is quietly fierce like that. The publisher of the U.S. edition, New Directions, is a straight-up indie publisher. They're one of the biggest and best of the indie publishers, but they're very much an indie publisher. And Hachette Dialogue Books, which is publishing it in the UK, was more of a mainstream publisher, and they think that the book has more commercial potential, and they wanted to give it a more commercially viable title. And Spontaneous Acts is a quote from the book, and it is indeed a title that is more likely for the book to, I don't know. I prefer the weird title myself. But, Yoko Tawada was consulted, and she said both titles were fine with her. So now we'll do the experiment, and we'll see how the book does in the different markets.
Now, Yoko Tawada, I was reading about her. In fact, you also mentioned it in your, I would say, afterword, which I thought should have been the foreword. Anyway, now Yoko Tawada is a very interesting writer. She was born in Japan at the age of 22. She migrated to Germany, and she starts writing in both German and Japanese.
Exactly. She's so fierce. She truly is one of my favorite writers of all time. I've been translating her also since the early 1990s. I started translating her when she and I were both babies, really. Right from the beginning, there was this incredibly shocking weirdness about her work. Her vision of the literary universe just blows me away. I'm just enthralled to her writing. She fascinates me, the way her mind works and the generosity of her creative universe. Yeah, I love reading the books that she writes in Japanese that are translated from Japanese, and I love when she writes in German because then I get to translate her.
So the Japanese books are totally different from the ones she writes in German, right?
They overlap a lot in terms of concerns and techniques and all, but her language use is different.
Now, one of the other interesting observations you made about Tawada's writing is that you said she uses a very specific style while writing in German, and she actively plays on the fact that German is not her first language. Can you give a couple of examples of that and how you handle that in English translation?
And that's a very hard thing to translate. She's always making fun of German words and making up puns. Like there's one story in which she writes about the mysterious or riddling or odd German language. The German word rätselhaft, riddle-like, means sort of mysterious. And she crosses the word Rätsel, which means riddle, with the German word Brezel, which means pretzel, a popular food item in Germany. And then she talks about the Brezelhaft, the pretzel-like German language. That one may have gotten a footnote.
Spontaneous Acts, there are many references to Paul Celan's poetry. I think in every page there is a reference to him. What is unique about Paul Celan, the poet?
So he's somebody whose relationship to language overlaps in some ways with Yoko Tawada's, even though German was a first language for him, but he was bilingual. He grew up speaking German, Romanian. He wrote in Romanian, decided to make German the language he wrote in. He grew up in Czernowitz, which is also where my paternal grandmother was born, a famously multilingual town. I think there were like 7 languages that were spoken in that town that, you could just get by with a mishmash of all of them. So he came from this very multilingual situation, but he makes the German language strange. And he also is writing about trauma, and specifically the trauma of being a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust. But he's writing about trauma in the language of the people who caused the trauma. And so his relationship to this language is at once one of great love because he's, grew up in that literary language and loves it. German's a very beautiful language, but is also horrified by what this language can do. And his poetry is all about estranging the language from itself and also from the reader, taking words, sort of forcing them into context where they seem to mean different things. Like here's a poem called Einführung, which is translated usually as stret or stretto, referring to that part of a fugue where the themes start coming back more densely, like a Bach writing a fugue where you have the themes introduced and then they get very thickly interspersed. And that poem, which is really a poem about mourning, uses a lot of technical language in German from geology. But he's using all these geology words in such a way as though that they sound as if they're the words for emotions and emotional states. Yeah.
Now, how significant do you think Tawada's choice of Celan's poems for the theme of this novel?
Yeah, I don't think she would have written this book without Paul Celan. I mean, I think his work and his person inspired it. He was also someone who, after the war, certainly didn't want to be in Germany or a German-speaking place, moved to Paris, and had, psychological struggles all his life. He was somebody who found this society that embraces so much violence unbearable to live in. And that's something that very much is the case for the character of Patrick, who is really just horrified by what he sees. It's a pandemic novel. It's set during the pandemic, even though she never explicitly writes about the pandemic, but she does write explicitly about sort of this wave of rising nationalism around the world, and how constricted our character feels just to be existing in a universe that contains all this, xenophobia and hate.
But that pandemic reference is very interesting. In one of the sentences, she says, "Eastern wind coming to Europe." Writing, I think that's the clue.
Yeah. And there's that bit about, before all the opera houses closed, then the sentence continues. So we know why they're closed.
And for me, this is nothing like anything that I have ever read.
Me neither. When I first read it, I just thought, what is this strange thing? Also, the way she keeps bouncing back and forth between first person and third person, and you don't know who's talking half the time. That's something she's played with in her earlier work too, though. That is a trademark move for her, but I've never seen it so densely, thickly applied as in this book.
The other one, the memoir of Polar Bear, I just started reading. At least I thought, okay, she writes like this too.
But if you're saying that, you're probably still in the first of the three chapters. In both the second chapter and the third chapter, she plays with point of view in a way that is really going to take you very much by surprise. And even if you know something strange is coming, you will not see it coming.
For me as a reader, whenever Patrick is talking about himself, either in first person or third person, let me tell you, it was deeply unsettling as a reader. So once the trans-Tibetan man enters, those conversations, in fact, they lit up the whole novel. It's so beautifully written.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lightness in their conversation, but we also don't know how many characters there are in this book, for sure. She keeps us guessing about so many, even very fundamental things. Yeah, and does he still have a job? Does he still have a girlfriend? There's pages where it seems like he does. There's pages where it seems like he doesn't.
I believe the ending justifies everything. Whichever way I understood ending, I think it justifies everything, whatever has gone on before. Yeah.
In fact, the ending of this book reminds me in certain ways of the ending of Siddhartha, which is also a book about friendship.
Yeah. It makes sense.
Because of translating the book, now I've read it like 5 or 6 times because I've I've read it in the course of translating it, and I read page proofs and the, revised manuscript and all these things. So I've read it very many times, and every single time I read it, I saw different things. And many things that didn't make sense to me the first or the second time began to make more sense to me later. She's very artful. Things do add up more than it seems like, but only on some readings. And there more than one interpretation about what happens, even at the end. There's several different ways one could understand that. And that's also a typical move for her. Like an earlier book of hers that I translated called The Naked Eye also has sort of an ending like this that is very open to interpretation like this.
This book, I was thinking it would be an ideal candidate for a read in a book club.
It's short. It's short. There's a lot to talk about. It's funny. Oh, that reminds me, I recently, Yoko Tawada did not tell me this, but I recently found an interview with her in which she says how she started writing the novel. And she had wanted to write an essay about Paul Celan, or rather another essay about Paul Celan, because she's written about him before. And she went to Marbach, which is where the German Literary Archive is. And she was looking at his papers there, and she found a medical textbook that he had written notes in the margins of. And seeing that book, so in her novel, she makes this book something that the character, the grandfather, the Chinese grandfather has. Yeah. So she puts this book in there, but seeing that book gave her the idea for the novel. And she says that she sat down and started writing it in the archive.
How do you compare the way German is used in his poetry to Tawada's prose in German?
Very different. She's not copying his way of writing, but she does have a lot of words and phrases from his poems in her novel. And, I tried my best to make them stand out as much as possible in English, but some of them become semi-invisible. I used Pierre Jarousse's translations a lot also, among other things, to create a contrast between my writing and his translations, help those quotes pop a little. But in German, they pop even more. And the German language reader is more likely to be familiar with the poem so as to recognize some of these quotes. For the reader in English, for some of it, you just have to trust me that there's Celan words in there. That's why I gave like a little list of them in the afterword. But I also don't think that you have to, somebody who's reading the book in German who doesn't know Celan's poetry at all can still read the novel and enjoy it. I don't think it's necessary to know the words to recognize. It's just an extra level. Also because she uses the words in very different contexts invariably than Celan did. So that's funny too.
The other interesting thing about your translation is that you have left some German phrases as it is. Is it to create tension between the two languages? Is that the reason you have done that? You could have easily translated them into English.
This is how I've started thinking about it. If I were writing a book in English set in Germany, I've spent a lot of time in Berlin. Say I write a book set in Berlin. And if I do that, I would definitely use a lot of German words to describe places and things I was experiencing, and that would not be strange at all. And so why should the translation not also be able to have some words of the sort that one might use them in German, even if writing in English anyhow?
Yeah. That made a lot of sense when I read about Yoko Tawada, as I said.
Yeah. Well, her writing is also always multilingual. She loves to put in, not even just beyond Japanese and German, she'll put yet other words into her work. She loves language. And, her main characters, she loves to write characters who are neither German nor Japanese. Like the protagonist of The Naked Eye is Vietnamese, for example. But that character, like her, speaks Russian. So, that's an important thing that Yoko Tawada has in common. like when she first came to Germany, she didn't speak German, but she spoke Russian. And so, she had this multilingualness, and I think she had some English that she had learned in school. She had multilingualist, but not for the language of the place where she was.
There is a recurring theme, interesting theme in the novel about median. It's a geographical term, then he makes it as a medical term, part of the body and all. And he talks about acupuncture, trans-Tibetan man.
Sure. Meridian comes from the title of the Celan's main, podological lecture. And so it's then a literary term, but I understand meridian as playing a role most importantly in this book because it's a connector between points. And I think about, in the novel, she talks a little about Paul Celan's friendship with the poet Nelly Sachs, who was she's not as well known today, but she was a Nobel laureate in 1966, I think. She was a German-Swedish poet, maybe 30 years older than Celan, and they had a friendship that was epistolary. They met, I think, once. And Celan wrote a poem about their meeting called Zurich at the Stork, because they met at an inn called the Stork. And in their correspondence, he writes about a meridian connecting Paris and Stockholm. The meridians are these connecting lines. It's geographical, the body is geographical, but they're also lines of friendship. And so that, everything about the book holds together this way.
When I finished reading it, I was wondering, there are many, many references to classical music, poetry, writers, Chinese medicine, and sudden shifts between first person and third person. I was wondering, how difficult it would have been it for you, though it's a very small book of 120 odd pages. How challenging was this to translate, and what are the passages where you have spent most time translating?
It's been several years since I first did it, so it's not that fresh in my mind, the beginning of the process. So she wrote this book in 2020 during the pandemic. And then, she sent it to me, and I was also reading it during the pandemic. So, I was reading it in the fall of 2020, and I translated it in the spring of 2021, which was in New York City, a terrifying, all of 2020 also, but, the pandemic was awful in New York City, as it was in many other places too. There was so little comfort. And we also had in the same period, the election, the horrible presidential election that, now we're having PTSD, but also deja vu about. And in all of that, translating this book was like a lifeline for me. I was supposed to be working on the Magic Mountain. I was already working on the Magic Mountain beforehand, but I was unable in the distress of and my father was also dying in this period. And in the great distress of the moment, I could not face Thomas Mann. But this little book by Yoko Tawada, which is all about trauma also, and about friendship in trauma. It's just like the book was like this hand of comfort and friendship coming into my life. And I sat down and was translating this book like in a stupor of escapism, in a sense, and I did a lot of research of everything she mentioned, every song, every literary reference. I was researching them all and following all the trails. It was wonderful. It helped me survive mentally that difficult period.
You are an academic and you are a successful translator. And you have been very vocal on the social issues. Maybe it's right now what is going on is in Israel and Palestine, or your presidential election. You have been very, very vocal. For students of literature and people who are practicing literature, who are in literature, how important is that to be very, very conscious about these things and vocal?
It's my personal belief that literature is political. And that certainly translation is especially political because we are always, by definition, dealing with more than one cultural context. And so no matter which two countries or which two languages you're involved with when you translate, there's going to be some sort of moral, political, social complexity in the relationship. And so I don't think it's possible to think about literature and translation as an art separate from what happens and what exists in the world. You know, literature is produced in a context, and it's always political. Even if you try and write writing that has nothing political about it, that itself is political, especially since I teach. And I want my students to be aware of where they stand in the whole complex cultural situation that every translator has to enter into.